I had just finished unpacking the last of my boxes when the exhaustion hit me. It was August 10th, and the sweltering heat of the day had given way to a quiet, muggy evening. My new apartment, though small, had a certain charm to it. The old wooden floors creaked under my feet as I walked through the rooms, admiring how everything seemed to have fallen into place. Yet, there was something off, a strange feeling of being watched that I couldn't shake. Later that night, after a quick dinner and a shower, I settled into bed. The building was old, I knew that, so the occasional creak or groan wasn't surprising. But as the minutes passed, I began to hear something else, something that made my skin crawl. A faint scratching sound, almost like nails dragging along the walls, drifted through the room. At first, I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it was a rat, or the pipes expanding. But the sound persisted, growing louder. The scratching seemed to move, traveling from one wall to another, as if something was creeping through the walls. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest, straining to listen. It wasn't a steady noise, more like a desperate, erratic scratching that echoed in the stillness. My eyes darted around the room, searching for an explanation, but there was nothing. Just the dark corners of my new home staring back at me. I pulled the covers up to my chin, telling myself it was nothing. But then I heard it, a whisper, a soft, almost inaudible voice coming from the shadowy corner near the closet. My blood ran cold as the words, too faint to understand, floated through the room. Every instinct told me to get up and leave, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear, trapped in my own bed, as the whispers grew louder. The next morning, the sunlight streaming through the windows felt like a blessing. I spent the day unpacking more boxes, trying to push the memory of last night out of my mind. It was just the old building settling, I told myself. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. As I moved through the apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me, watching my every move. The air felt heavier, colder, in certain spots. It was subtle, but it was there, just enough to make me uneasy. That night, the scratching returned, louder, more frantic, as though something trapped within the walls was trying to claw its way out. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the TV, but the noise seemed to seep into my thoughts, distracting me at every turn. And then, around 3 a.m., came the knock. 3 sharp raps on the front door. My heart leaped into my throat. I hadn't seen a single soul all day, and there was no reason for anyone to be outside my door at this hour. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door handle. Slowly, I opened it, the hinges creaking ominously. The hallway was empty. Not a single sound, not a single trace of anyone having been there. The air outside was still, the faint hum of the city life beyond my walls a distant memory. I shut the door quickly, locking it behind me, feeling a wave of anxiety wash over me. Something wasn't right with this place. Back in bed, I lay awake, every muscle tense, waiting for the next sound. I felt the air shift again, a cold draft brushing past me, even though the windows were all closed. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I turned to face the corner where I'd heard the whispers the night before. The shadows seemed deeper there, darker, almost as if they were alive. And then, from that same corner, I heard it again. A soft, breathy whisper that sent chills down my spine. The next morning, I was determined to find out what was going on. After a restless night of whispers and scratching, I couldn't take it anymore. I started by searching the apartment thoroughly, looking for any logical explanation. As I rummaged through closets and checked behind furniture, I discovered something unsettling. In the bedroom closet, hidden behind a row of shelves, was a small, barely noticeable hatch. It looked old, its wooden frame covered in dust and cobwebs, like it hadn't been touched in years. Curiosity overtook my fear. I opened the hatch, revealing a narrow passage that led to a windowless room. The air inside was stale, and a thick layer of dust covered the floor. My heart pounded as I stepped inside, scanning the walls. Strange symbols, faded but still visible, were etched into the plaster, their meanings lost to time. In the center of the room was an old box, its lid slightly ajar. My hands shook as I opened it, revealing a stack of yellowed photographs. The photos were of my apartment, though they must have been taken decades ago. In each image, the place looked different. The furniture was older, the paint chipped, but one thing remained the same. In the background of every photo, a dark, shadowy figure loomed, its form barely distinguishable, but undeniably there. My stomach twisted in fear as I flipped through them, each picture more unsettling than the last. What had happened here? That night, the atmosphere in the apartment shifted completely. The air felt charged with a malevolent energy, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The scratching had become more erratic, as if something was desperate to escape its confinement. I sat in the middle of the living room, trying to calm myself, but it was useless. Every flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, every creak of the floorboards, sent waves of panic through me. I knew I had to confront whatever was haunting this place. The night was suffocatingly quiet, the only sound my own breathing, which had become shallow and rapid. I gathered my courage and approached the small, hidden room again, determined to put an end to whatever had been tormenting me. The strange symbols on the walls seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light, as though they were alive. I couldn't explain it, but something in me knew that this room held the key to ending the terror. As I stepped inside, I noticed something I hadn't before. An old diary lying in the corner, half buried under dust and debris. I picked it up carefully, flipping through its fragile pages. The writing was shaky, the words almost illegible, but I could make out enough to piece together the story. It belonged to a previous tenant, someone who had lived in the apartment many years ago. They too had heard the whispers, seen the shadows, and been haunted by the scratching in the walls. But unlike me, they had never found peace. According to the diary, the tenant had become obsessed with the apartment's dark energy, convinced that the shadowy figure in the photographs was a restless spirit trapped in this place. They had tried everything to free it, performing rituals and carving symbols into the walls in a desperate attempt to break the curse. But in the end, they had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only their writings and the remnants of their failed attempts. I felt a strange sense of pity for the lost soul that had been trapped here for so long. As I lit a candle in the middle of the hidden room, I whispered a quiet prayer for peace, hoping that it would be enough to calm the spirit. The air in the apartment seemed to shift almost immediately. The oppressive energy lifted, and for the first time since I'd moved in, the space felt calm. I returned to bed, exhausted but relieved, and for the first time in days, I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The next morning, the apartment was still and peaceful. The scratching, the whispers. Everything had stopped. I felt lighter, as though a great weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The haunting was over, and I finally felt at home in my new apartment. Whatever had been trapped here had found peace, and so had I. The nightmare had ended, and in its place was a sense of quiet comfort. I knew now that I could stay here, unafraid. It was September 15th when I first arrived at the cabin. Nestled deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town, it seemed like the perfect place to escape the stresses of life. The isolation was what I wanted, a break from the noise of the city. The cabin was simple: one room, a fireplace, and large windows overlooking the dense forest. The stillness of the place was almost unnerving. No sounds of cars, no distant chatter, just the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of an owl. As the sun set, the woods seemed to close in around me. The darkness here was different, thicker, almost tangible. I locked the door and settled in for the night, feeling a strange mix of peace and unease. It wasn't long before I heard it: footsteps outside the cabin. At first, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a deer wandering too close. But as I listened closer, the sound was unmistakable. Deliberate, heavy steps, pacing back and forth just outside the walls. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously approached the window, my heart pounding in my chest. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just trees and shadows. I told myself I was imagining things, that the isolation was playing tricks on my mind. But as I turned back toward the bed, I heard it again. A faint tapping, this time on the window. I froze. The tapping was soft but persistent, like someone gently knocking to get my attention. My stomach twisted in fear. I didn't dare approach the window again. Instead, I climbed into bed, pulling the covers over me, trying to convince myself it was just the wind. But deep down, I knew that something, or someone, was out there, watching me. The morning brought little relief. I barely slept after the strange tapping on the window, and the eerie feeling still lingered as the sun rose. I decided to take a walk around the cabin, hoping that the daylight would dispel the unease. The forest was dense, the trees towering above me, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. But then, I noticed something strange. Footprints. They were large, human-like, and led from the edge of the woods straight to the cabin. I followed the tracks, my heart racing with every step. The prints circled the cabin several times before disappearing into the woods. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that someone had been here, pacing around the cabin while I was inside. I wanted to leave right then, but my pride kept me rooted. It had to be a prank, I told myself. Some local trying to scare off outsiders. But the deeper I walked into the woods, the more I felt that familiar sensation, like I was being watched. That night, I tried to settle in again, convincing myself that the day's events were just a coincidence. But as the hours passed, the tapping returned, louder this time, more insistent. I sat frozen in bed, listening to the rhythmic knock on the window, my hands gripping the sheets tightly. Then I saw it, a shadow passing by the window, just out of sight, moving slowly as if it was waiting for me to look. My pulse quickened as I struggled to make sense of what was happening. The shadows outside seemed to flicker, dancing in the moonlight, and once again, I felt the overwhelming presence of someone, or something, just beyond the walls of the cabin. The tapping continued, relentless, echoing in the stillness of the night. I didn't move, too afraid to even breathe, wondering what was out there in the dark. I couldn't take it anymore. The next morning, I decided to investigate further. The footprints were still there, leading away from the cabin and into the dense woods. Against my better judgment, I followed them. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. Even the birds had fallen silent. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the forest itself was watching me. My heart raced as I realized how far I had wandered, but I couldn't stop. I had to know what was out there. After what felt like hours, I stumbled upon an old campsite. It looked abandoned, though recent enough that the fire pit still had ashes in it. The remnants of someone's life were scattered around. A torn tent, empty cans, and a few old books left behind. But the strangest thing was a set of carvings on the nearby trees. Symbols I couldn't recognize, crudely etched into the bark, similar to those I had seen on the cabin walls. I felt a deep sense of dread wash over me. Whoever had been here wasn't just camping. They were waiting for something. As the sun began to set, I knew I had to get back to the cabin. But the moment I turned to leave, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they were closer, much closer. I spun around, scanning the trees, but there was no one there. The footsteps grew louder, and I felt my chest tighten with fear. I broke into a run, the branches tearing at my clothes as I sprinted back toward the cabin, the sound of footsteps echoing behind me, growing faster with every second. I burst through the door of the cabin, slamming it shut behind me. My body trembled with exhaustion and fear. The footsteps had stopped the moment I crossed the threshold, but the sense of being watched had not. The symbols on the walls seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, and the air felt colder, almost suffocating. I collapsed onto the floor, unable to shake the feeling that whatever was out there had followed me back, and it was only a matter of time before it made its presence known. I sat on the floor of the cabin, my back pressed against the door, struggling to catch my breath. The oppressive silence hung in the air, so thick it felt like it was closing in around me. I knew I wasn't alone. The tapping hadn't started again, but the weight of unseen eyes was unbearable. Every shadow seemed to move. Every creak of the old cabin sent a jolt of fear through me. The symbols on the walls seemed more vivid now, as though they were trying to tell me something, but I couldn't understand their meaning. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the roof, like something heavy had landed above me. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared up at the ceiling, waiting for whatever it was to make another move. The bang came again, this time closer to the edge of the roof, like someone or something was pacing back and forth. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing a fire poker from the hearth, not knowing what I was planning to do with it, but needing something to hold on to. The footsteps on the roof stopped, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, out of nowhere, the cabin's windows began to rattle violently. The sound was deafening, like a storm had suddenly erupted around me, but outside, everything was still. I backed away from the windows, clutching the fire poker tighter, my mind racing. The pounding on the windows grew louder, more forceful, until I thought the glass would shatter. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The rattling ceased, the footsteps vanished, and the cabin fell into an eerie silence once again. I stood frozen, waiting for the next attack, but nothing came. The air felt heavy with anticipation, like something was just out of reach, watching, waiting. I sank to the floor, exhausted trying to make sense of what had happened. But there were no answers, only more questions. The next morning, I packed up and left the cabin without looking back. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had escaped something I wasn't meant to understand. But the mystery of that night, the symbols, the footsteps, they would haunt me forever. And as I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods, watching me leave. The day I found the abandoned campground, I was just passing through the outskirts of a small town. October 20th marked the start of what was supposed to be a relaxing road trip, but I had no idea how it would end. The sun was beginning to set when I saw the faded sign on the side of the road, Maple Ridge Campground. Curious, I decided to take a look. The dirt road leading in was overgrown with weeds, and the further I drove, the more desolate the landscape became. When I finally arrived, the place was a ghost town. Old tents, rusted camping chairs, and abandoned fire pits dotted the area, all left behind in a hurry. The air was unnaturally still, as though time had forgotten this place. I stepped out of my car, the silence around me so thick that it pressed on my ears. There was no wind, no birds, just an eerie quiet that sent chills down my spine. Despite the overwhelming sense of abandonment, I couldn't resist the urge to explore further. As I wandered deeper into the campground, I found a series of old cabins, their wooden walls rotting and caving in. I peered inside one, my flashlight casting long shadows across the decaying interior. Dust covered everything, and the smell of mold hung heavy in the air. But it wasn't the dilapidation that bothered me. It was the feeling of being watched. My skin prickled with the sensation that someone or something was nearby, just out of sight. The sun dipped below the horizon, and I knew I should leave, but something held me there. The campground seemed to whisper to me, beckoning me to stay. As darkness fell, I set up camp near one of the old fire pits, telling myself it was just one night. But as the night deepened, strange sounds began to echo from the surrounding woods. Whispers carried on the wind, distant but unmistakable. I tried to ignore them, but the unease gnawed at me, growing stronger with every passing minute. The whispers grew louder as the night wore on. It started as a soft murmur, like the wind stirring through the trees. But soon, it became clear that the sounds were voices, distant and disjointed, but undeniably human. I sat by the fire, the crackling flames offering little comfort against the cold dread that was creeping in. My eyes darted around the darkened campsite, but there was nothing. Only shadows shifting and stretching in the flickering light. I tried to convince myself that it was just the isolation getting to me, but deep down, I knew better. Something was out there, something watching me from the edge of the woods. The air felt heavy, as if the very atmosphere was pressing down on me, suffocating and thick. My breath came in shallow gasps as the whispers turned into soft, eerie laughter, children's laughter echoing from the trees. I stood up, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. My flashlight flickered as I scanned the woods, searching for the source of the laughter, but all I could see were the dark, twisted shapes of the trees. The laughter stopped suddenly, leaving behind an oppressive silence that made my heart race. I felt a presence then, something lurking just beyond the reach of the firelight. Every instinct told me to leave, to get in my car and drive away as fast as I could. but my legs felt rooted to the ground. I turned back toward the cabins, hoping to find some clue, some explanation for what was happening. As I approached one of the larger cabins, my flashlight caught something on the ground. Footprints, but not fresh ones. They were old, almost faded, leading toward the back of the building. My pulse quickened as I followed them, the uneasy feeling growing stronger with every step. The prints led to a small door, half hidden by overgrown weeds. I hesitated for a moment before pushing it open, the rusty hinges creaking loudly in the quiet night. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow, dark passage that seemed to descend into the earth. The air inside was damp and cold, with a musty smell that made my stomach turn. My flashlight flickered again as I stepped into the passage, its beam barely cutting through the thick darkness ahead of me. The walls were rough and crumbling, and I had to duck slightly as I moved forward, feeling the oppressive weight of the earth pressing down around me. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but something pushed me forward, a pull I couldn't explain. The whispers had returned, louder now and more distinct. They echoed off the walls, surrounding me, but I still couldn't make out the words. It felt like they were trying to guide me deeper, pulling me towards something unseen. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached the bottom of the passage, where it opened into a small, dimly lit room. The floor was covered in dirt, and the air was thick with dust that clung to my throat. In the center of the room stood a large stone slab, old and weathered, with strange symbols carved into its surface, similar to the ones I had seen in the cabin. I approached the slab cautiously, my flashlight sweeping over the strange markings. They were unlike anything I had ever seen before. Twisted shapes and jagged lines that seemed to pulsate faintly in the dim light. As I reached out to touch one of the symbols, a cold gust of air swept through the room, sending chills down my spine. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as if they were trying to warn me of something. I pulled my hand back, suddenly aware of how wrong this place felt. It wasn't just abandoned, it was forgotten, buried deep in the earth, hidden away for a reason. That's when I saw it. Just beyond the stone slab, half buried in the dirt, was a small wooden box. My pulse quickened as I bent down to examine it, brushing away the dirt with trembling hands. The box was old, the wood cracked and brittle, but the carvings on its surface matched the symbols on the stone. I hesitated for a moment, but something compelled me to open it. The lid creaked as I lifted it, revealing a bundle of old photographs inside. The photographs were faded, but as I sifted through them, a sense of dread settled over me. They were images of the campground, years ago, before it was abandoned. But in each photo, there were people standing in the background, their faces blurred and distorted. They were staring directly at the camera, their eyes dark and empty. I flipped through the photos faster, my hands shaking, until I reached the last one. It was a photo of the very room I was standing in, but this time, there was someone else in the picture. A figure standing behind the stone slab, barely visible in the shadows. A chill ran down my spine as I realized what I was seeing. I wasn't alone in this room. Something was watching me from the darkness, just as it had been watching those who had come before me. My breath caught in my throat as the whispers reached a fever pitch, the air growing colder. I turned to leave, but as I did, the door to the passage slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping me inside. The slam of the door echoed in the small room, reverberating off the walls as the air seemed to grow impossibly colder. My breath came out in short, sharp gasps as I turned toward the door, my mind racing with panic. I rushed to the door, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was stuck, locked, or maybe held in place by some force I couldn't understand. I was trapped. My heart pounded in my chest, the reality of my situation sinking in. The whispers around me intensified, growing louder and more frantic, filling the air with an overwhelming sense of dread. I pressed my ear to the door, listening desperately for any sound beyond it. But all I could hear was the hollow silence of the campground above. The weight of the darkness in the room felt suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. I turned back toward the stone slab, my flashlight trembling in my hand as I scanned the room. The shadows seemed to move of their own accord, shifting and swirling around the corners of the space as if alive. That's when I noticed it, a figure standing in the far corner of the room, half hidden by the shadows. My heart nearly stopped as I saw the outline of a person, their face obscured in darkness. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure was completely still, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. All I could do was stand there, frozen in place, as the figure began to move toward me. The air grew colder with every step it took, the whispers now a deafening roar in my ears. The figure's movements were slow, deliberate, almost as if it were savoring the moment. I stumbled backward, my back pressing against the cold stone of the slab. The figure drew closer, its form becoming clearer in the dim light. It was tall, its face still hidden in shadow, but I could feel its gaze on me, dark, hollow, and filled with an ancient malice. Just as the figure was only feet away from me, the whispers suddenly stopped. The silence was so profound that it felt like the world had been sucked into a void. The figure halted, standing just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I could see its outline clearly now. Tattered clothes, emaciated limbs, but its face remained a dark void, impenetrable. For what felt like an eternity, we stood there, locked in a silent standoff, the air between us thick with tension. Then, without warning, the figure turned and slowly receded into the darkness, disappearing into the shadows as if it had never been there at all. The air in the room shifted, becoming lighter, and the oppressive cold began to lift. I stood there, trembling, unsure of what had just happened. My legs felt weak, my mind struggling to comprehend the events of the last few moments. With a creak, the door behind me swung open on its own, the passageway now clear. I didn't hesitate. I ran up the stairs, my feet pounding against the dirt floor as I scrambled to escape the room. When I finally burst out of the cabin and into the cool night air, I collapsed against my car, gasping for breath. The campground was silent once more, but I knew I had been marked by something far beyond my understanding. I left that night and never looked back. But even now, I can still hear the whispers sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, reminding me of what waits in the shadows of that abandoned campground.